name's John Buck. I'm part of the Bevry community, a platform for open collaboration and discussion. Today, I am joined with Inspiring Christianity on Twitter, or Salem, as well as Dr. Randal Rauser, author of the book Conversations with My Inner Atheist. Let me make sure, do we have, yeah, that's right. The right format for so we can see all of us. Welcome, Randal.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, John.
Yep. And also thanks, Salem, for joining us. I wanted to sort of set up this discussion. It's kind of weird to do it on this channel because the Bevry community is sort of more of a, I guess, non-denominational sort of philosophical group in order to sort of bring coalition between many different sort of styles and approaches to these things. So it's not necessarily like a Christian channel. But this will also be mirrored on Salem's channel as well. But I found your approach, especially when speaking to atheists and secularists, to be quite fascinating and much better than I think most Christian apologists that are online. And I think your book in particular is something that I think a lot of people that have maybe been more reserved against Christianity could find a lot to really draw from within your book. From the maybe if you could sort of describe what the book is for anyone that's interested.
I'd love to do that. So the book is it's a conversation with my inner atheist, hence the title. So the idea there is really twofold. So on the one hand, it's the idea of having an internal monologue with the voice of questioning and doubt that most, if not all, people have. Right? We often have questions and doubts about our beliefs. And I think often, certainly in the tradition I grew up in the church, the response to that voice of doubt was to kind of muffle it with a pillow. And I think that often when you do that, you actually impoverish yourself and your intellectual maturation. So the first element of the book is to listen to a critical voice of doubt and introspection. And I just dub it an inner atheist. It could be all sorts of things. The bottom line is, these are serious problems that I have to think through in terms of my beliefs. There's a second piece to it as well, however, and that second piece is sort of the practice of steel manning. So where straw manning is often caricature, well, it is by definition, caricaturing objections to your view or contrary views by treating them in their weaker form and then acting as if your rebuttal to the weaker form is a sufficient rebuttal for all forms. And I think often we do that, right? We all engage in straw mans all the time. And we have a tendency often to do that. We go for the low-hanging fruit. Well, a steel man is the opposite. What it tries to do is to make objections to your view or contrary views look as strong as possible, and then see if you can still defeat them. And so really it's twofold. Then on the one hand, I did want to engage with my own sort of existential project, wrestling with my own questions and doubts, but also steel man the critical views of others in a sort of twofold internal monologue over 25 chapters.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that. I think that sort of problem of straw manning is something that I'm sure a lot of atheists and secularists nowadays have sort of that problem with many online and just in general in real life, that when the articulation that the theist or the Christian tries to put forward of the other person's views just is almost crafted in such a way to affront the other person. And so I think, by actually putting forward their views and like the arguments against Christianity, that's the interesting thing, is you're presenting like what seems to you the best arguments against Christianity, or what most skeptics would be most likely to latch onto, and really putting sort of a fine sort of critical eye from within your own tradition, which is very, very rare to see people take on that sort of intellectual rigor, and it's a noble attempt.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Go ahead,
what I find what's common with what somebody would suspect with these books is you would just make up, you wouldn't do an easy argument and just knock it down and there goes the book and nobody would get anything out of it. But what I really like, you actually sometimes ended with your inner atheist or ended with this. You didn't really answer the question there, or you didn't really get all this there, and that's why. Like some of it, you even admitted at the end of the book, some of it is there's just mystery to it, and we just don't know the answer right now, and that's okay for the most part. So That's what I really liked. It wasn't just a strong, so what somebody would expect with this kind of book, oh, it was a strong man that's easily knocked down. It's actually the best from the other side. So that's what I really appreciated about the book.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it really lifts a weight off one's shoulders when you realize you don't have to pretend you have more settled convictions than you in fact have. And so the idea that sometimes we can just be free to admit areas where we are uncomfortable with things, then that is, I think, a relief. And it actually, in the long run, like some people, again, growing up, is sort of the expectation was you got to have all the answers. And so if you don't, then that's like your Achilles heel, your vulnerable point. But the irony is, I think when you begin to admit, hey, I'm not sure how to think about this, I'm continuing to wrestle with it, that's not actually an Achilles heel. That's a sign of intellectual honesty, and it raises your level of credibility in the eyes of other people if you are willing to do that. Whereas it's the person who can never admit that they're wrong or that they have any concerns that we kind of get suspicious about.
Yeah, and just to sort of let our audience know a little bit more about the book, it's laid out in this sort of direct dialogue between you and your inner atheist, who goes by the character named Mia, or My Inner Atheist. And it's sort of a back and forth, both yourself, she is presenting arguments for her position and like something that seems pretty obviously an affront to the typical notion of Christianity, and you are sort of responding to that in sort of a few different ways. What's interesting is like you're sort of presenting multiple options that are available for the Christian. Rather than sort of taking on this particular position, you're sort of providing a response that could be one way, could be another. And it's kind of funny, Mia is not necessarily satisfied by that because it's not as clear cut as one would hope it to be, especially if you're sort of brought up in a sort of more fundamentalist understanding of Christianity, where all the answers are laid out a priori, and any sorts of questions or problems can be just returned back to those without much further thought.
Yeah, that's right. And I think like I've appreciated that same attitude in the atheists I know who I most respect are the ones who can recognize the weaknesses in their own position and they can qualify it. And they may be a naturalist, but they say, I got problems with naturalism nonetheless. Or maybe I'm not convinced of naturalism, but I'm thinking about this. Maybe I need to adopt a richer metaphysic, but I'm still not going to consider theism. Once you start talking like that, with that kind of nuance, then I automatically want to talk to you more, because that kind of qualification is an open invitation to dialogue. But when a person says, you're not going to crack my armor, then it's like, okay, well, I'll just keep going then. It's probably, we're not going to have a good conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good point. Okay, so like what is maybe like a starting question that you might put to someone, or maybe some like red flag that you would be able to notice, this person that I'm already started some sort of engagement with is maybe not serious enough to put much more time into, or they are somebody definitely worth investing more time into so that you can maybe learn from them.
I posted a tweet the other day where I made a comment that I used to try to win over people that gave clear signals that they were contemptuous of me and my beliefs. And, you know, it would kind of be like the comedian who's trying to make that one person in the room laugh, who's scowling at them with their arms crossed. And I would kind of focus on that one person that was looking at me with a sneer and try to convince them that I'm in fact a rational person worthy of respect and dignity. And frankly, I found for the most part that you end up wasting a lot of energy on those people. It's so anyway, I'll just say what I do then is I try to say, I'm going to look for people and I'm going to invest in relationships and conversations with people who are not from out of the gate hostile and contemptuous of me. Now, there are other cases where you might develop relationships with people where they're contemptuous of you. And I'm not saying don't ever do that, but I'm saying, like, if you want to do that, be in it for the long haul, and don't start by talking about religion or Christianity a lot. Just share life together, maybe go out for a beer, talk about a movie, and then let the theology come as they develop some degree of respect for you. But if you just want to kind of jump in and have a good conversation, don't start with people that say, oh, you're going to tell me about your sky daddy? Right? Because it's probably not going to go well.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, so Salem and I had sort of, as we were going through your book, sort of come up with a few questions for the particular chapters. Salem, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So the first chapter that I really, really connected with and enjoyed was your chapter on if the Bible had immoral laws, how could it be inspired? And that was, it just kind of put up a new perspective that I never thought about. So would you want to answer, just because I know your answer in the book, would you want to say how you solved especially with some specific ones in the Old Testament?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there, like the one thing that we have to sort of start off with is a real robust description of what the problem is. And so I definitely tried to do that. So just to give a specific example, I mean, I talk about a little bit of legislation within the Torah that describes the conditions under which you would stone a child if that child was being insubordinate. And so I mean, I think there's a couple of things we just have to think about here. One of them is, because I would say this, especially when you grow up within the church, then you've read this kind of description of people being stoned and so on or you heard stories since you were a small child, and it probably doesn't hit you with the shock that it should. And so I think we have to, first of all, acquaint ourselves with the shock of the text. Not to get on a tangent, but in another one of my books, I give an illustration. I said that we've often Disneyfied the Bible. And so I give an example that in Grimm's fairy tales, the story of Cinderella, Ashputtel, is actually an extraordinarily violent story. So for example, Ashputtel's sisters, when the glass slipper comes to the house, one of them cuts off her big toe in order to fit her foot into it. The other one hives off her heel. And each time the prince only realizes that it doesn't actually fit because blood is squirting out of the glass shoe. And then afterwards, a couple ravens fly out of the sky and they peck these young women's eyes out.
Oh, man.
And so then you realize, wow, so these original stories, as they were told within European culture as fables, they were extraordinarily violent. And when Disney got their hands on them, they Disneyfied them and they took out all the violence. And I think often it's the Bible is like that. We've Disneyfied it in our own readings, and we've kind of failed to recognize how violent it is. Even to the extent when I was in youth group in high school, and some of us got together on a Friday night and we watched Life of Brian. I don't know if you've ever seen Life of Brian, but it's a classic Monty Python film. And then there's this scene where this guy's getting stoned to death, or he's getting stoned for blaspheming God. And so people are throwing rocks at him, but it's actually a comical scene. And so you have all of these kinds of images. Well, there was a film that came out about 10 years ago, based upon a real life stoning in Iran in about the year 1980. A woman was pelted to death with rocks. Her name was Soraya. And so the last probably third of the film, or maybe 30 minutes of the film, is her being stoned to death. It's extraordinarily graphic. She's buried up to the waist. People begin to throw rocks and her head snaps back as it hits her on the forehead. And so it's just shocking, like, to the nth degree. And you think, okay, that's what it means to kill somebody by stoning. And then you add in, well, what does it mean to kill a child by stoning? Now, it could be a young person, 12, 13, 14 years old. But some of the things we recognize is that children are kind of morons. And one of the reasons is because they lack impulse control to the degree that an adult has, and they lack the ability to anticipate consequences as an adult does. And those are a couple of good reasons why we don't exert capital punishment in civilized society on legal minors, because they can't grasp the consequences of their actions to the degree that an adult can. And so you kind of take those two things, converge, and you have this text which describes what we would today consider to be an atrocity if it happened anywhere in the world. And so you have to say, okay, how do we think about what that is doing within the Bible? Particularly because some of the biblical authors, they describe the Torah as this brilliant way to govern one's life and a society. And so you have to come to terms with that. So one big piece I think I can recognize from my perspective is moral accommodation in the text. That there is, God has perhaps you could say God has met people with different imperfect moral understandings of how to govern society. But that doesn't mean that we want to adopt those approaches now. Now, another thing I would certainly push for is a Christo-centric reading of the text. In other words, always reading it through Jesus. And I don't think that Jesus actually, based, let's say, upon the woman caught in adultery, I don't think Jesus would endorse stoning as a judicial punishment. And I don't think Christians should. And so whatever I'm going to think about Torah should be read through the eyes and the life of Jesus. So that's a starting point. But I think we have to start with recognizing the problem, recognize that the text has more moral complexity than we probably recognize, and then be honest with it, and don't force ourselves or anyone else to sacrifice our moral convictions as we are given one reading of the text.
You know, that was actually a big thing for me, that it just one day it hit me that like with these like people that we praise in the Old Testament, like King David, like Abraham, like Solomon, they weren't as good as we like that we kind of make it up in our mind. These are like, as any like middle person in the Middle East, like warlord in the style, that they weren't as good as I thought they were growing up in this sense. And I was like, wait a minute, these people like raped and killed people. This doesn't seem right. So that's why I appreciated your perspective of showing that the more progress in there. It's not this like perfect thing, even as Jesus said himself. So that's what I really appreciate, a different perspective growing up in what I normally hear from.
Thanks for that. I'll just, one other example that comes to mind, Philip Jenkins, in his book on biblical violence, he talks, for example, about the death of Samson. So of course, Samson is in the middle of a crowded hall, and then he pushes out the pillars of the hall, so the whole hall will collapse and kill all the civilians within the hall. And Philip Jenkins talks about that event, which I'd never thought about this before until he mentioned it. But he says that has a lot of resonance with the contemporary suicide bomber in the Middle East. Where you have an oppressed group, in this case, Samson and the Israelites being oppressed by the Philistines, and they exert violence upon a civilian population in order to seek some political or geopolitical redress for their group. It is a lot like in the occupied territories, someone dropping a bomb in a cafe or something.
Yeah, I don't know. In a sense, you can sort of see how utterly real the Bible is, in that it actually includes all of this stuff in it. It's like the world isn't Disneyfied for us. Like, if we're actually to be contending with reality as it is, there's going to be these very confronting sort of realities that it's hard to sort of stand with, or hard to sort of take on from a very sort of Western modern sort of culture that we're within. There was a question I had, well, actually, I guess two questions. From that sort of Christological interpretations or reading of the Bible, so that you're reading the Bible, I actually really appreciate the way that you sort of lay out how you read the Bible. The Bible is to bring about a more Christ-centered focus within the reader, so that they can become more like Christ in their actions and how they interact with others. And it's where does that draw from?
Well, there was a principle that I sort of paraphrase from St. Augustine, and I originally encountered it through Eric Siebert. So he's an Old Testament scholar. So anyway, it's the gist of it is always read and interpret the Bible so as to increase love of God and neighbor. So that if you adopt a particular reading where you end up, if that reading forces you to objectify or dehumanize an individual or a population, then you're not reading it right. And so when you have, for example, in my view, when you have evangelicals who say, yeah, you know, the occupation of Canaan is in fact a genocide by legal definition, but it was justified morally because they were so evil and wicked that we had to eradicate everyone, including the infants. What you end up doing there is trying to objectify and justify genocide, which I think is just a mistake. Mm-hmm. So I would say if you go back to that and you say, does this reading increase love of God and neighbor? Keeping in mind that neighbor is always the out group. I mean, this is the important thing, that neighbor is not your buddy, your in group, it's the out group. It's the tax collector, it's the prostitute, it's the leper, it's whoever in your society is not in the inside. If your reading dehumanizes them, there's something wrong with it.
Right, yeah. It's very easy to love your friends, but Christians have a much higher burden of loving their enemies as well. There's, I guess, maybe a concern that the traditionalists might have, or the sort of evangelical readings of the Bible, that there's almost this divide that you're putting forward between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament, and that the God of the Old Testament very clearly sanctions these sorts of like the eradication of the Canaanites, whereas the God of the New Testament, or of Jesus, seems much more loving and forgiving and accepting of all. Is there a way to sort of cohere those two together without like going into like full-on Gnosticism of rejecting the God of the Bible entirely, of the Old Testament entirely?
Yeah, this is often the charge is thrown out as Marcionism. So, well, you're a Marcionite. And of course, Marcion was, he came from, I think it's Sinope in Asia Minor in around the year 145 to Rome. And then he began teaching, and was wealthy, he gave a large cash donation to the Roman Church. But he began teaching that the book of Luke and a few of Paul's epistles, actually a truncated version of the Gospel of Luke and a few of Paul's epistles, are the Bible. And he rejected the Old Testament entirely. And so he actually appears to have been the catalyst for early formation of canon, because he sort of drew up, to our knowledge, the first sort of official statement of what a canonical list is. Unfortunately, he turfed the Old Testament. And he did so because he said, well, very Gnostic, as you said, in thought, that the Old Testament reflects this sort of errant God, which is just a fundamentally different being than the God of the New Testament. And so often then people say, okay, you're a Marcionite. I think, first of all, that when you throw around charges like that, it's very unfortunate. All you're trying to do is quash dissent by labeling people with various heresies. So be very careful about that. Second is it's not Marcionism at all, because again, Marcion, among other things, he rejected the Old Testament. He didn't interpret it in light of the New Testament, which is what I would propose. He rejected it. He rejected the God that created the world as a false deity, coming from a Gnostic perspective. He rejected the virgin birth of Jesus and the early life of Jesus. He believed that Jesus sort of appeared as an adult in a quasi, we call it docetic view, of Jesus not really fully human, but fully divine. And so none of those are elements of anything I would propose, or others like, let's say, Greg Boyd would propose. So it's just a wrong charge to say it's Marcionite. So what I would just say is, first of all, what I'm doing is proposing reading the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, which is actually core to the DNA of the New Testament. Reading the God as presented in the Old Testament in light of God as presented in the New Testament. There are multiple images that we do have to address in the Old Testament. If you read Ezekiel 16, God is described as this enraged lover. First of all, he's an adoptive parent who adopts an orphan girl. And then when she's ready for love, he now switches roles and he becomes her lover, which right there is already just problematic on multiple levels. And then when she is unfaithful to him, he becomes enraged and he has her cut to pieces. Now, that is a brutal image, and especially thinking a Me Too generation, that kind of image of God. So I think that we have to be willing to critique images of God within the Bible that are sub-Christian. And I think that is a sub-Christian view of God. And when the psalmist in the imprecatory psalm says that God laughs at his enemies and he looks forward to their destruction, I think we have to say that that's an errant view of God. Now, what we're not saying is that, therefore, let's get rid of it, because I think it's all there for a reason, which is part of what plenary inspiration means. But it may not be there to give us the correct view of who God is. It may be there as part of a developmental story of theological reflection. And it should be read in light of Jesus, and that's what I'd propose.
Well, now I'll sort of take the position defending the Marcionites in a sense. If we're to be reading the Bible in light of Jesus and trying to become more like Jesus, if it were the case that somebody's reading of the God of the Old Testament just shook them to their core to the point that it made them really question their faith, would it maybe be better for that person to not take on the burden of reading the portions in the Old Testament and only stick to the gospel message?
Well, there is a reason, I think, why when you are making new converts, you often will give them, you start off with the Gospel of John. right?
Mhm.
You typically don't start off, hey, why don't you read Leviticus or
Ecclesiastes,
Deuteronomy,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I think that makes sense. But what that has to nonetheless be part of is a programmatic attempt to bring people to the point of grappling with the whole counsel of God, to
Mhm.
bring them through a process of catechesis or education to reading the whole of Scripture and then coming to wrestle with it. So yeah, you should anchor them, I think, in the New Testament, and Jesus is revealed in the Gospels. That makes sense to me, but you have to eventually come to the totality of Scripture and figure out what you're going to do with it.
All right,
No,
thank you.
I
Yeah, go
really
ahead.
liked, I really liked how you drew a distinction. This was kind of like an open, like I just saw it differently from now, the human intention of the text and the divine intention of the text and how they could be different. And that was a moment I never really thought about before. And then when you made it, I'm like, wait, that actually makes a lot of sense for like a lot of passages in the Bible to read it through this lens. So that was kind of like eye-opening for me when I was going through that, which I really enjoyed that perspective, just because I've like never heard of that before, but it just made so much sense to me when I read it. So like that was just a new perspective for me that I really enjoyed reading.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think in the book I give the model of the Bible as like a God's like an editor, in a sense, that he appropriates the words of human beings within his text, but his intentions as the divine editor may differ at some point from what the human author originally intended, because God's not constrained by the meanings that they intended. And so, for example, I mean, this is not a controversial point, really, because you see it all over the New Testament. So, for example, when we read in Matthew that out of Egypt I called my son, we need not say that Hosea had a particular meaning in mind when he wrote those words, but nonetheless, Matthew gives a fuller meaning, which we would call perhaps the sensus plenior, or the plenary, the full sense of the text, which is different than what Hosea intended. And if the imprecatory psalmist says God laughs at his enemies and looks forward to their destruction, and I say, I'm not going to read it that way in light of Jesus, I'm going to think something else is going on in that text. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be there. It just means that maybe the human author didn't know exactly what God was doing.
There's a really
this
interesting.
view also.
Yeah, go ahead, Theo. Sorry.
I was going to say this view also makes sense of like the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, which isn't necessarily what we take nowadays. We don't take that view, but it could be that they were using it for this purpose, but God could still have a better or more fulfilled purpose to use that for his purposes, to show that he. So yeah, no. So like it just made sense so much when I heard there's a difference between the human intention and the divine intention, the divine revelation of that text.
So I mentioned briefly the term accommodation. So God accommodates to the human understandings of the human authors. Doesn't necessarily mean God approves everything. And so you're right that you can apply it to what we've been addressing, theological content and moral content, but also scientific content. The Old Testament is clearly written within the thought forms and the worldview of ancient Near Eastern culture, which is a three-storied view of the universe. God allows himself to communicate to the people through that because he wants to reach them, but it doesn't mean that God is thereby teaching to us a three-story view of the universe.
There's an interesting, I guess, revelation that you sort of had that I hadn't considered before, but I guess in reading biblical commentaries on some of the, like, especially the notion of like child stonings, is the justification that's given for those practices it's not really like a retributive punishment for the child, but rather it's more so because the honor of the parents has been slighted, such that if there is such a rebellious child that is sort of like spouting off against their parents or something, it puts shame on the parents too. And it's such a fascinating component because it points out that this is a honor culture, a culture wherein the basis for morality is pretty much like what status you have between people. And it's fascinating because like Christianity is sort of like revelatory to especially the pagan world in bringing about sort of a new ethic of a dignity culture, I think it's referred to in sociology. And I'm curious if, given that these are like two vastly different approaches in regards to ethics and morality, how is there a way in which an honor culture can be understood within a dignity culture, or maybe vice versa? Because it almost seems to me that they're like two like completely contrary ways of looking at things, it's hard to see a way in which they can be fully, packed together in some sense.
Yeah, there's certainly the well, first of all, the idea of the honor culture, it is certainly very much there throughout the Old and New Testaments, and it's more resonant than often with the Middle East and with Eastern cultures than with Western and North American cultures, which really lack that kind of framework. So we think in terms of guilt rather than shame, and we don't think so much in terms of honor as well. But I think that the honor and shame culture did have a big impact on the early church going into the Middle Ages. One example I think you could find in Anselm's satisfaction model of atonement, an appeal to honor and shame categories. So here you have, well, how can it be just for God to punish a person for a finite sin eternally? Well, because of the person that was offended against is of infinite value. And so the repercussions is infinite shame and thus an infinite retribution owing. So for example, it's like one thing to kick dust in the face of a janitor. It's another thing to kick dust in the face of the king in an honor shame culture. And if you think, as they did at Anselm's time in a medieval culture, that about the king as having this great infinite honor, then to offend against that honor is to warrant eternal punishment. And so you could, I think, view Anselm's framework very much within that culture. So I do think that it was present often subsequent to the New Testament era.
Taylor, did you have another question you want to go over?
Yes, I have one more that's kind of related to this. It was your chapter on the God of the Bible versus the God of the philosopher, which I found very interesting. And because there does seem to be two distinct gods, and this is like I've recently have heavily considered like the idea of open theism, or that the future is open, just because the biblical text seems to be so clear, and there seem to be good philosophical cases for that too. But and I found your illustration of the chair, which is literally like empty space, or I forget exactly what one did, is very interesting. And it's related to like the idea that God like accommodates to the culture as well.
Yeah, so that illustration, so there you have, on the one hand, you have a chair that you have the sort of lay person's description of a chair or a table. Let's say a table is like a solid oak object, so you can put things on it. It has weight and heft, and it can hurt you and bruise you and so on. But if you go down to the quantum level, then in fact it's just vibrating packets of energy with empty space. And so you can have these different layers of explanation. So then the question is, and they're reconcilable. You can scale up to the table, or you can scale down to the vibrating packets of energy. The question then is, to what degree can you scale up and scale down to these different, the layperson's model of God versus a theologian's technical model of God, and whether claims such as God being atemporal or impassible or having omniscience in terms of knowledge of future contingent actions, whether that is something that you could scale in a way relative to the layperson's perspective. So there's a big question there. One thing I would say in terms of the Bible is that I think you have certain different theologies present within the Bible. Some of them are more immanent in nature. Some of them are more transcendent in nature. So God is very immanent within Genesis 2 and 3, for example, in this very ancient narrative, it seems, where he walks in the garden and shares life with them. But then if you read God as described in Isaiah 40 to 48, God appears to have moved significantly closer to the God of the philosophers, as it were, because God seems to have a heavy emphasis upon an infinite qualitative difference between God and all other creatures. God knows all things and has control over all events in a way that other creatures do not. And so the question then is, maybe there is some development within the biblical text as well.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's almost like the Bible isn't setting out sound systematic theology or anything like that. It's more so, I don't know, I see very much it's mythopoetic in that it's coming from a lot of different sorts of authors from many different perspectives. Like, you got to appreciate just how incredible the Bible is, spanning thousands of years between authors, and yet still having some sort of coherency between it and a sense of continuity to it as well, which is astounding, really.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the editor analogy, when I describe the Bible, I describe it in analogy to the Norton Anthology of American Literature, which is a famous textbook that gathers together all the writings of the American people for back from the 1600s to today. I think it's in 2 volumes now. And so the idea of the Norton Anthology, it brings together poetry and essays and stories and legal documents and all sorts of other writings to tell the story of the American people. It's not a systematic political philosophy or social theory or anything else. It is a real, in a sense, ragtag, but it's a very intentional collection to tell the story of the American people. And I think the Bible is in the same way a very eclectic but very intentional description of God's people in terms of Israel and the church. Again, with a diverse multiplicity of genre of literature represented, but no single view of theology or of politics or of society or anything else.
Keeping on this topic of the God of the philosophers and the God of the Bible, in this sort of day and age, it's kind of fascinating. You can find some people that have, like, maybe they grew up in a religion and then found that it conflicted too much with the science that they came to understand, or maybe the progressive morality of the time that they've come to understand, and it just doesn't make sense to rely upon the Bible for your moral wisdom. Or even people that have not been raised in a religion. Maybe they're born in some sort of a more secular sort of country like UK or Sweden or something like that, but have been drawn towards maybe the arguments from philosophy for God. Like, say, from, well, it's funny because most of the people arguing for God nowadays are actually Christians, but suppose that they can get on board with, say, the argument from simplicity or of beauty or just any of the argument for God's existence. And what would be maybe an argument or a reason that you might give them to go further than that in I don't know, coming to accept Christianity, right? Like, for what reason would maybe it would be better, like, from their perspective, it just seems simpler and easier to just accept, yes, there is a perfect being who exists that is the creator of the world, but I don't like adding in the Bible and all of this sort of history and background is sort of like too much to really conflict with that conception I have of God, of the philosophers.
I mean, I would start with Jesus. I think that's a good place to start, is to read the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that the Bible is inspired, and I do think that it speaks to people with unique authority and power and has done so for centuries. And so I think a great place to start is look at what the Bible says about Jesus, and then just ask the question, could this God have been revealed in this person? And then, of course, that I think looking at the life and teachings of Jesus, and I think what we have there is their unique authority and power. The next step would then be to say, hey, well, then is there evidence that this Jesus, in fact, did die in these ways that the Christians believed and that he came back to life? And I think there's a good case to be made there. So I think that there's that, like, you could argue that sort of stepwise into an evidential case. I think for many people, that even very intellectual people, that it's simply just sort of coming to see things in a new way and just say, yeah, this seems right to me. And so I think it's the vast minority of people who were persuaded to become Christians because they read N.T. Wright's Resurrection of the Son of God. I think most people it just seems, this makes sense of everything. Yeah. So, and I think, like, in terms of, I don't know if this is a great analogy, but I used to watch CNN. I don't like to pay for cable, and so sometimes I'd find people streaming CNN on YouTube. And so there'd be a lot of streams for CNN. And now most of them are duds. And the way that you can kind of get a read on which would be the live stream that actually is working is how many people are watching it right now. So there'd be one that might have 2 people watching, and there might be one that has 2,000 people watching. Well, start with the one that has 2,000 people watching, because that's most likely the one that actually is live streaming CNN successfully. And I think that, trivial though that may seem, that there's a good case to be made that if you're going to take seriously the possibility that God's revealed himself, hey, start with the biggest religions out there. And I think certainly Christianity has the highest numbers, right? It's the most people streaming. So why didn't you start with Christianity?
No, that's a good argument, actually.
What I thought, because I know in like conservative or like apologetic things, like there's so much emphasis on the resurrection of Jesus, and that's kind of like the whole thing. And I think it would be beneficial if we try to look at different arguments and try to from a different perspectives, because it doesn't seem, well, it is convincing to a lot of people, but it just seems like we should be getting a wider horizon when arguing for Christianity than just hyper focusing on that one.
Yeah, I like the term hyper-focus because I think that's true. There's no doubt the resurrection is critically important. And I think for the most part, the focus is justified. But I do think that sometimes we can get a little bit of tunnel vision and fail to recognize that there is a much wider field of arguments that we could explore. So, I mean, one thing that I find is interesting is like when atheists, with some atheists, sort of the atheists that like to troll Christians, right? They'll have like the picture of, your God died on a cross, my God has a hammer, and then they have a picture of Thor, right? And they'll say, any questions? And so there, the idea is that, well, our God's really powerful, your God's kind of a wimp. And the irony there is that, of course, this is exactly what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 1, that the cross is foolishness to Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews. But to me, there's something intuitive about that being actually, and ironically, a strength of this revelation, that it surprises and shocks you. In one of my books, I tell a story about a Buddhist monk. So this Buddhist monk was living in the monastery, and then a shogun came in, and or a samurai, and he started killing all the monks. And he comes into the chief monk, and he raises his sword, and the monk's just sitting there stoically, peacefully meditating. And then this guy with his sword dripping with blood, he says, don't you know that I could kill you in a second, and you're just sitting there, serenely or something. And then the monk replies, don't you know that you could kill me in a second and I'm sitting here serenely? It's a power encounter. And the thing is that the monk completely turns the tables. Who has more power? Christianity does something in a really fascinating way like that it is the one who dies on a cross, who submits himself to this punishment that was not owing to him, that he did not deserve, and then conquers it through peace. That in fact shows true strength. And some of the greatest movements in history, from Gandhi to, of course, Martin Luther King, have recognized the power of that story to transform society. So it seems to me that, hey, let's talk about that wider narrative and the power of that narrative. And yeah, not just the resurrection, yeah, it's critical, but the whole life of Jesus, his submission to death, all of these things are part of that story as well.
Yeah. Even like exploring like an argument from incarnation, or the idea that God would become incarnate because he's this all-loving being. And if you look at all like the major religions, it seems to be the one that is the good as such, who then put himself down and come down to then be with us. So I think that's an argument that can be thrown out of it. It's not like not focusing on the resurrection, but just only focusing on the historicity of the resurrection, or trying to prove it through that means, which is good. I think it can be, it's done successfully by like N.T. Wright and Mike Lagona, but just trying to explore more aspects of Jesus, like you said, his character and actually coming down, unlike all the other, at least most of the other religions.
There's a story, I think it's from the early, about 1982. I think Yuri Andropov was the prime minister or premier in Russia at the time. And then there's a young girl, I think her name was Samantha Smith. She was, I think, from the state of Maine. I put a lot of I thinks because I pretty much got the story down, but a few details might be a little off. But she wrote a letter from America to Yuri Andropov saying, why do you want to kill us? And then Yuri Andropov, he got this letter in Moscow, and he wrote a letter back to Samantha. And he says, Samantha, we don't want to kill you. Russians love life just as much as Americans. We want to live in peace with all people. And it's a really beautiful, eloquent letter. Now, you can say, oh, it was just Soviet propaganda. Fair enough. The thing that strikes me, though, is the power of a sovereign power like him addressing a single individual through a handwritten letter. And you think about incarnation, that is in a sense like the ultimate handwritten letter. It's God actually taking on incarnate form and coming into our midst. So I think that there is like an incredible power in that concept of incarnation. And it's not, I mean, there are other religions that have theophanies. They have God manifesting God's self as a human being. But Christianity has this extraordinary claim that the one God in the second person of the Trinity took on a human nature. And it's not just a temporary thing for 30 years, although that would be incredible, but it's actually, he's taken that into the very nature of the Godhead. So that even now, the definition of God is one being in three equal divine persons, and the second person also has a human nature. So God's definition has changed in that sense. Now, there's a whole question about immutability, and that's a conversation to be had another day, perhaps. But I think that that's a pretty extraordinary picture. It's a radical one for sure.
Yeah. Salem, do you have another question?
I have one more, but I've been asking a bunch lately. So if you
sure.
have another one.
Yeah. I'll go ahead. Let's see. Let me pull up my notes real quick. I guess from the sort of incarnation in Christ, it seems almost, I guess, maybe weird in a sort of way from somebody that might be outside Christianity. The whole notion of God coming and taking on a human nature and then being crucified for our sins. It's very much, I mean, I can see how that can make sense from within like a more barbaric or ancient context where blood in, blood out sort of thing, like blood is how covenants are built off of. And if there's some sort of breaking of a covenant or a violation or something like that, then blood must be spilt in order to respond to that. In our own sort of day and age, that whole notion of blood covenants and sacrifices is so outside of our sort of window of understanding morality at all. Is there a way that crucifixion can still be as impactful for somebody that is kind of not within that sort of ancient Judaic context? As like, I'm sure it was very impactful for those people at that time, but right now it seems almost just bizarre.
To some, like there's a lot here in terms of how we precisely understand the atonement in terms of theory. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to get into that per se, because I think that there are many theories of atonement. I'm not really persuaded by any of them. I have yet to read, like I've had a lot of criticisms of penal substitutionary theory, but I've also heard enough about William Lane Craig's new book on it that many different theories of atonement. But the core idea of atonement, we could just start with that. And that is the idea of substitution. So this like core idea that Christ is our substitute. In some way, Christ takes on the impact of sin and alienation from God that was properly owing to us. And through that, there is a restorative bridge that is allows us to be reconciled to God the Father. And I think that when we go from there, we can tell all sorts of stories. And in fact, again, these are just the intrinsic power of these stories of redemption, I think, is perennial to people. And so the one that I give in the book, if memory serves, is from the film The Iron Giant. So that was an animated film that came out in the late 1990s. It's really a modern minor classic of animation. It was directed by Brad Bird. Yeah, who went on to do Tomorrowland. Wasn't the height of his career, but The Incredibles, among other things. He's a Christian.
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, he is.
Yeah, that fits very much. I mean, the whole Iron Giant story is like severely Christological in its spirit.
Yeah, it's very, very a lot of Christological allusions, even more than E.T., which has a ton, by the way. But in the Iron Giant, so this giant, it's in the year 1957. It's in Maine. There's the Red Scare because Sputnik, this new Russian satellite, Soviet satellite, has just been launched. And at the same time, no relation to Sputnik, this alien robot lands in the Maine forest, crashes there, and he's like a 50-foot tall robot, and he befriends a little boy named Hogarth who doesn't have a father, and they develop this amazing intimate bond. And then this military learns about all this mysterious things happening relating to the robot, and they begin to think it's the Soviets. And through all of this happenstance, misbegotten events, they end up firing this nuclear warhead at the town, and they're all prepared to die. And so then the Iron Giant, I get emotional when I think about this story. I mean, I love it. So he says to Hogarth, "You go, you stay, I go," and then he flies up. And then they had talked earlier about Superman, because Hogarth had said you should be like Superman and be good and that. And so the Iron Giant flies toward this nuclear warhead, and he closes his eyes and he says, "Superman." And then the last second he hits, and there's this huge explosion, and he saves the town. That's atonement. Like, that's a story that I can resonate with. We might not understand some of the categories of the temple sacrificial system, but we know what that is. And that's the core idea of substitution. And he saves the town thereby. Now, another one I could give is a contemporary example, and that's the film Gran Torino. And so in that film, you've got this gang that's terrorizing the suburbs of Detroit. They're a Hmong gang, which is a Vietnamese youth gang. And ironically, the story is also the redemption of the grumpy old kind of racist Korean war vet played by Clint Eastwood. The Hmong people move into the neighborhood, and so he's like the last Caucasian guy left there, and he doesn't understand them, they don't understand him, but he eventually befriends the kids next door and gets to know the family. And he then tries to protect the family from this gang with violence. And what happens is the gang retaliates, and they rape the girl living next door. And what that says is, if you want to respond to violence with more violence, it only begets more violence. It's a vicious cycle. And so there's this moment where Walt, he goes then into his kitchen, he's enraged, and he starts punching the cupboards, because the only way he's ever dealt with anything is through violence. At the end of the film, he comes to the clubhouse for the gang, and he stands outside, and they're expecting him, and they know that he has a gun. And so then they come out with their guns, and they're looking at him, and he says, "Got a light?" And then he puts his hand into his jacket, and they think he's reaching for a gun, and they all open fire and kill him. And then he goes back, and his hands go into a Christ figure pose, and he dies. And it turns out he was just reaching for a cigarette lighter. He knew that they would respond that way. And what happens then in the story is, by giving his life, he saves the community from the gang, because now the gang gets arrested. And so the community is saved from them. So that's another example of substitution and redemption in narrative. And I think what we need to do is tell in countless ways the power of that story. Because some images don't speak to us. Perhaps they're a little bit alien to us. Well, let's re-narrate that story in a way that will grip people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, like, even now, like, you can't really get away from the aspect of sin. And it's not just the sin of others, but the sin of your own self, and like how to find redemption in a world where you have committed some sort of moral failing of some sort. And then what does that even mean? How can you find salvation from that? And it's weird sort of associating, I don't know, these are very religious terms to be put into it. But I mean, the fact of the matter is you're not perfect. You're going to make plenty of mistakes as you go through life. And how to resolve those mistakes is a question that is kind of left open for our sort of modern secular society. Like, it's just a fact of the matter. But there's no real existential sort of relief that's provided with, I think, the secular framework of moral evils that one might commit. Because that's the thing. It's very easy to sort of point out the moral failings of others and sort of decry them for that. But when you have this burden of guilt from your own doing, that's something even further that is hard to relinquish. And yeah, I don't think we have sort of a proper secular replacement for that theological doctrine within Christianity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, I mean, there are, like, when people like Richard Dawkins, all they do is they focus on a few cherry-picked issues like biblical violence and creationism and stuff, and then they turf the whole thing. They have not bothered to try to steel man what are the intrinsic powers of this worldview that have perpetuated it for 2,000 years. And I think once you do, you may not become a Christian as a result, but I guarantee you will come to respect Christianity if you really take it seriously. And the multiple nuanced ways that it helps explain the human story and offer a solution to the classic human problem.
Right. All right. Salem, if you have like one last question, and then I'll have one last question, and then I have an announcement for anyone that's stayed this far into the live stream, and then we can sign off from there. Yeah, go ahead, Salem.
For sure, yeah. So my last question would be towards like the idea you touched on it a bit in your book, the idea of like hell and the idea of like non-existent unbelievers, because like when you first encounter at least apologetics, at least it's not that you see a lot of resistance from a lot of people, but then there are people that you encounter who either former Christians or either they don't seem resistant at all and just seem entirely. It's like there's just a couple of people like the Relate Theology team or some other people I've encountered that you've interviewed even, that they seem like completely non-resistant, completely willing, but they just like don't see like the evidence for like, and then how could then a loving God then send them to hell forever for just somebody who would completely then go for their. So I was like, yeah, no, that's sort of my final question.
I didn't catch the last bit. So are you saying how should we think about the non-resistant non-believer?
Yeah, like the idea of a loving God sending like a non-resistant unbeliever who's like kind of like what Schellenberg touches on in his book on divine hiddenness, a completely non-resistant unbeliever who would then accept it, but then just doesn't because they don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, I don't think that anybody who is non-resistant will end up alienated from God forever. I mean, I think that so we need to sort of start off with what is our baseline. Like, and so for me, the baseline is anybody who's truly non-resistant will not end up alienated from God forever, because God wants to be restored and reconciled to every creature alienated from God, because that's just the nature of who God is. We can always ask the question, why does God not presently reveal God's self now in God's fullness to people who are truly non-resistant? And I mean, I think that there could be all sorts of morally sufficient reasons God has to allow that kind of thing. And so we could talk about greater goods. I think that you could talk about greater goods within that. And I'll just give one quick hypothetical, right? I think we have to be very careful about ever talking about specific individuals or any specific scenarios, but something like this. So let's say that a person cries out to God now, like, God, where are you? Why don't you hear me and answer me? And they're non-resistant, and God doesn't respond, but God responds a year later and they're restored to God. But in the year during that intervening year from when they were non-resistant to when God finally revealed himself, something happened in their story, which is going to form part of their narrative of redemption that will touch the lives of countless other people and lead other people to enter into restored relationships with God. Could God thereby have a morally sufficient reason to have withheld himself from that person for a year, in order to have that person have that deeply impactful experience that would touch the lives of millions of other people potentially? And I think, yeah, God could do that. So that doesn't mean in any particular story I would ever purport to know why God does something, but that makes sense to me. And so that would be a reason. If somebody truly is non-resistant, then this could be why. I will say that there are other times where people purport to be non-resistant, and maybe actually they, at some level, they're not. Like, we're not always in touch with the degree to which we might have hostility or some other emotion toward a particular scenario. So I think the problem for Christians often is that they've right away gone to that sort of explanation. And so I think we have to be careful about that, because I have seen what I think is evidence for non-resistant people, but I also think that we can be in danger of overestimating. Yeah. Twitter's good for that. So yeah, that's just my quick response. But I do think that J.L. Schellenberg is a great example. Like, he's I've never met him in person, but I've had a lot of interaction with him online and that, and he seems like a really wonderful, gentle, kind person. And that was his story. So I don't know the state of where he's at or how to understand that, but I do know that anybody who's truly non-resistant, God will not withhold himself from them forever.
Just piggybacking off of that, in the book, you sort of lay out these two types of Christians that you might have. The people that are very steadfast and sure in their belief, in their faith, as sort of maybe the sails that might push forward a boat or a ship. But besides that, there's also the sort of more skeptical person that is suffering through doubts. Was that the mast or of the boat or something? Maybe I have it.
Yeah. So those who don't have questions, they have a lot of certainty and conviction. They're like the ballast that centers, that holds the boat, and then those who question and doubt, they're like the sails that catches the wind and moves it forward.
Right. I had a question regarding that. Like, I don't know. It seems at least there's a lot of people in our day and age that theism and especially Christianity is not so much a live option for them. So William James in his Ethics of Belief, he regards like there are certain beliefs that are open to us in being able to accept or believe. But for something that just surpasses our plausibility scale or something like that, as perhaps for some theism or Christianity might do, is there a space within the church for those types of people that might be non-resistant but still desirous, maybe having some sort of desire within them towards God, but not being able to find that satisfied, that those skeptical doubts satisfied? In fact, I think Peter Kreeft uses this example a lot. Albert Camus, he's somebody that couldn't become a theist, but knew that saintliness was something that was sort of the pinnacle of human existence. And so even though he couldn't believe in God, he desired to be a saint. And is there a way for somebody like that to sort of, I don't know, somehow work with maybe the Christians that have been able to find satisfaction in their doubts?
So I like when Pascal, he's dealing in the wager with those who are doubting, and he tries to give them a rational calculation that will help them make the leap. And then he deals with, well, but if you're still not sure, then just come to church and take the sacrament, which is a really interesting kind of advice, because today I think often people think, well, you should only take the sacrament if you're really sure of everything.
Yeah.
But what Pascal says is, I mean, he's recognizing from a Catholic perspective the intrinsic sacerdotal power, or the grace-giving power of participation in the sacraments. And even if you don't have that theology of the sacraments, even if you think in a lowly Baptist sense that they're sort of just symbols, as it's sometimes said, there is still wisdom in moving into that degree of participation. Now, I'm not saying if you don't count yourself a Christian, take the sacrament. What I am saying is just participate in the life of the community and the things that you value within that community. There are, back to the early church, there have always been levels of participation. In the early church, there were hearers, and then there were those who were baptized and others. And today, I think likewise, you often have within a healthy church, you have people, some guy who's dating a girl and he's not really sure about this whole Christianity thing, but he's going because she goes, and she's been going since she was a little kid. And maybe he will find his way into faith in that way. And so I think that churches need to welcome people on various different journeys. Often it's been talked about in terms of thinking of the church more as a centered set than as a bounded set. So the bounded set idea is that there's a clear demarcation between insiders and outsiders. But a centered set is focused instead on the idea of which direction are you moving? Are you moving sort of toward God on a journey, or are you moving away from God? You know, do you want to be a part of this community, or do you want not to be a part of this community? And that takes a lot of the kind of requirements off in terms of having to have some long confessional list that you're willing to sign off on simply to be coming to the church and participating within the life, and doing all the good things like potlucks and picking up garbage on the side of the road and Halloween parties or hallelujah parties that churches do. So yeah, I'd be a big advocate of that.
All right. And just as a final question to sort of finish us off, Randal, why ought a Christian take dialogue with their inner atheist?
I think that you should dialogue with your inner atheist if you have one. And I mean, not everybody has one, or I think we all do to some degree, but I think some of us, it's louder than others, we'll put it that way. So first of all, because those questions are there, and again, that those questions will prompt you, I think, into a deeper understanding of faith. They'll help you to move from milk to solid food, as you could say. And that also will, among other things, give you greater empathy for those who are outsiders, who often have these same kind of objections. It will make you not only a more effective apologist, but a more effective disciple who can reach out and just share life with other people and understand where they're coming from. So I think that there's a lot of value in having that conversation.
Yeah, that's very good. All right, so I want to thank everyone for watching us. We've had a few people joining in live, and actually somebody, X-Rabbit, had a question that, Salem, your question actually just brought up, so it's perfect. But just for everyone that has taken all this time to spend with us, I have multiple copies of Randal's book. If anyone's interested, just shoot me a DM on Twitter, and I'll be sure to send you a ebook copy or a Kindle version for you. Salem, do you have anything else to add, or Randal?
No? I just thank Randal for the interview. It was really fun. I enjoyed interacting and you answering all the questions that me and John had. So thank you.
It's been a delight, gentlemen. I really appreciated sharing the time. And given that this is like everybody's still chewing their nails, watching the votes come in on various American states, it's nice to be talking about something other than politics for an hour. So
yeah, hallelujah. All right, thank you all for watching, and I am ending the stream now. There we go. An hour and 6 minutes. Yeah, that was great.